Ellis Morgan, a black woman dressed in simple, understated clothing, was pulled from her first-class seat at the airport. She remained silent, enduring the barrage of suspicious stares, biting jokes, and blatant discrimination from the flight crew. But no one on that flight knew they were targeting the very woman who held absolute power over the entire airline. As the truth slowly surfaced, the price for their prejudice would come swiftly, and no one would escape it. Do those who choose racism deserve the consequences they bring upon themselves? Tell us where you're watching from, and stay tuned until the end to see how it all unfolds. When Ellis Morgan stepped into the main hall of Logan Airport, the sky was still dark before dawn as the early light barely filtered through the towering glass, casting long, delicate streaks over the cold, white stone floor. She was unhurried, each step measured and calm, as though she were not merely a passenger about to embark on a journey, but someone intimately familiar with the very pulse of this place, dressed in a deep blue coat layered over a light gray hoodie, dark, neat jeans, and old yet clean sneakers, carrying nothing more than a worn beige canvas bag with a slightly frayed strap that was meticulously folded, a sight familiar to one who had traveled, alone, countless times. She carried no rolling suitcase, no stylish accessories, no high-end headphones casually draped around her neck like many of those queuing at the priority counter, yet the screen of her phone clearly read Boarding Group 1, First Class, Seat 2A, a detail that contrasted starkly with the common definition embraced by the crowd surrounding her. She turned into the line reserved for first-class passengers and special members, where an attendant at the gate, his name tag gleaming with Brentley, greeted her with a half-smiling, half-hesitant glance before stepping forward half a pace and politely, though tinged with prejudice, stating, "Hello, ma'am, this way is reserved for business class and priority members," to which Ellis responded with a slight nod, holding out her phone, and saying succinctly, "Right, it's my group," prompting Brentley to offer a subtle smile, neither warm nor uncourteous, as he scanned her code, his eyes flicking over the screen once more to ensure the system was correct. Behind her, a white man in a tattered hoodie and rumpled khakis, dragging a creaking suitcase, approached, and Brentley immediately smiled at him, asked no further questions, and swiftly swiped his card as though it were the obvious course, while Ellis walked past the barrier in silence, though she could distinctly hear the murmurs behind her, quiet enough not to be overtly rude, yet sufficient to affirm that someone like her was always an anomaly in a system governed by definitions that did not include her. Next came the security checkpoint, where the line meandered slowly past the inspection counters as it did every Monday morning, and once more Ellis presented her documents and boarding pass, but upon reaching the scanner, a TSA officer, a middle-aged man with short-cropped hair and a receding chin adorned with a sparse beard, raised his hand in front of her, instructing, "Ma'am, please step to the right for a random inspection," and without a word Ellis turned right, as accustomed to the scenario as one might be to being judged solely on appearance before uttering a single syllable. Her canvas bag was placed on the table, and a younger, seemingly more complacent officer opened it and meticulously examined each item, asking in a tone of lazy suspicion, "What is this?" When he discovered her files, to which she replied briefly, "Legal documents," without any defensiveness, prompting him to inquire, "Are you a lawyer?" And she answered simply, "Not exactly," her gaze never leaving the file in her hand, as he hesitated, flipping through the envelope uncertainly before finally setting it aside and proceeding to check the bag's flap. Finding nothing compelling enough to delay her, yet his eyes remained locked on her face, as if desperately searching for even a minute justification to validate her singled-out treatment. At the waiting area behind, a white woman in her 50s, clad in a beige trench coat and adorned with a pearl necklace, cast a glance toward Ellis with an expression devoid of open hostility, yet brimming with suspicion, a look that made Ellis wonder if only for a brief instant how many more years such a gaze would remain fixed upon people like her. Tyson then nodded and said, "You're clear, you can proceed," leading Ellis to gather her bag and sling it over her shoulder, and as she stepped away from the inspection counter, the ambient noise persisted. The sound of suitcase wheels on stone, the steady announcements over the airport speakers, and the murmurs of quiet conversation. But for her, every step away from that checkpoint served as yet another affirmation that in this system, no proof was required to harbor suspicion toward a black person. The white lights above the airport ceiling reflected off the glossy tiles, stretching into cold streaks that Naomi Ellis had seen too many times before. The gate to the first-class cabin gleamed like a mirror. Everything here was spotless, orderly, and fair. Every nameplate clear, every procedure labeled, standardized, and every passenger served in order. But it was only when Ellis Morgan stood just steps from the boarding gate that she felt it clearly. Some rules weren't printed in any manual, yet were executed with precision, in the flick of a glance, in the tightening of a jaw. She stood in line like everyone else, her e-ticket scanned, her luggage checked, her documents in order, everything in sequence. But just as she was about to step through the boarding gate, a voice cut in coldly from the left, like a command. "Ma'am, step aside." Ellis turned to the woman who had spoken. Her eyes weren't on the boarding pass or the system screen, but directly on Ellis, as if it wasn't the ticket, but Ellis herself, whose legitimacy needed to be questioned. And what stung more than any official procedure was the quiet gaze behind her, the unspoken confirmation from others that they already believed what seemed obvious, that a black woman didn't belong in a first-class cabin. She stopped, phone still in hand. "Is there an issue with my boarding pass?" she asked, her voice so steady it made the air around them pause for a moment. Stephanie didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced down at her list as if searching for a reason to justify the command she'd already given. Before she could speak again, a flight attendant emerged from inside the cabin. Roxy, hair tied in a tight bun, uniform crisp, eyes sharp, and a tight-lipped professional smile, the kind trained to be neither offensive nor genuinely welcoming. She stepped close to Stephanie, leaning in just enough for Ellis to hear her murmur into the earpiece, her tone flat, as if describing someone who had wandered into the wrong area. "Thought this was first class, not a support program." The words were light as air, no name mentioned, but everyone understood. Ellis heard every syllable, each one slicing through the pride she'd built over the years. From a young age, she had learned one thing: reacting doesn't always change reality. She looked directly at the airport staffer holding her boarding pass, watching him scrutinize it as though searching for something deeper than the name, the flight number, and the date. This flight was like a miniature society, operating on its own quiet rules. Here, equality was written in the handbooks, but in practice it was shaped by stares and assumptions. Black passengers had to explain more, walk slower, and prove things others never had to. Ellis had seen this before, at the check-in counter, during security screening, even while ordering a drink in the luxury lounge. And now, right here at the gate, she had the ticket, the documents, the right to her seat, and yet she was brushed aside like a file with an uncertain origin. Behind her, the line of passengers kept flowing. They glanced at her, only for a moment, then looked away, as if this scene was too familiar to bother questioning. No one found it strange that a black woman had been singled out, because somewhere deep inside, many had been taught that faces like hers meant trouble, meant poverty, meant support programs instead of privilege. Ellis stood still, both hands resting on her suitcase. She knew that what she faced wasn't written in any official clause. It lived in the way people looked at her, in that invisible space between having a right and having that right acknowledged. To some, being asked to step aside might feel like nothing. But to Ellis, it was a reminder that in many people's eyes, she had never truly been recognized. What she faced that day was the shape of an invisible wall, one that had stood for generations, waiting for someone like her to walk close enough to feel each brick pressing into her dignity. Naomi Ellis walked slowly toward the private waiting area, her hand still steady on the suitcase beside her as if nothing had just happened. But in her other hand, tucked discreetly inside the inner lining of the bag at her side, She held something far more valuable than a first-class ticket, a slim, pale red envelope. None of the crew suspected a thing. To them, Ellis was simply the kind of passenger who didn't fit. She hadn't come asking for better service, nor did she need a warm welcome. She was there to observe. This entire flight, from check-in to the stares of the staff, was a test. Not for her, but for them. Inside that red envelope was a 37-page financial document, along with a special clause. The final sign-off on a $4,100,000,000 0-cents capital deal between Genesis Holdings and Havenport Air. Ellis was the last person to approve it. Half of that money would go directly into the very airline operating today's flight. This was a request from Genesis's oversight team, a quiet trial before the final disbursement. They wanted her to experience the service as a regular passenger, under an unannounced identity, to see how the system reacts when it believes it's dealing with someone who holds no value. That phrase, someone who holds no value, was what compelled her to accept the assignment. And everything that had happened since she walked into the airport had said more than enough. From the check-in attendant's look, to Roxy's whispered joke about a support program, to Stephanie's curt command to step aside like she was some kind of system error, it all matched the assumptions Genesis had only theorized about until now. Had the crew known the truth, things would have gone differently. She'd have been escorted to a VIP lounge, probably greeted with a different smile by the domestic terminal manager, and Roxy, the flight attendant with the bitter mouth, might have adjusted her tone, but Ellis didn't want that. She didn't want respect because of her name in the paperwork or the dollar signs people envied. She wanted to know how the world treated her when all of that was stripped away, when she was just a black woman boarding a plane with the ticket she paid for. And the answer revealed itself piece by piece, in every expression, in every voice, in every watchful glance as she took her seat, 2A, by the window. The seat was pristine, a glass of lemon water already waiting, but the attendant who passed by didn't stop. Other passengers were greeted by name. Ellis wasn't one of them. When she raised her card to request a drink, the attendant gave a slight eyebrow raise, a quick nod, and walked away in silence. Each act was small, but together they built a pattern Ellis knew too well. She opened her bag and glanced once more at the red envelope, as if to remind herself, this is power. But real power doesn't need to be displayed. It's in the steadiness you keep when you're underestimated, in the calm you hold amid a room full of indifference. In that moment, Ellis didn't need an apology. She needed proof. The flight was preparing for takeoff. She adjusted her seatbelt. A different attendant approached, a middle-aged man more polite in demeanor, but still cautious. "Apologies. Looks like there's a mix-up with the meal list. Would you mind waiting until we've served economy?" His voice was soft, ordinary. But Ellis had flown too many times to miss the truth. This didn't happen to other passengers in the same cabin. She knew the code, who gets served first, who gets delayed, and how the reason was never technical. "No problem," she replied, calmly, expressionless. Sometimes, patience is the sharpest trap. It lets others expose themselves. It lets the system reveal its cracks. The plane began to taxi. Around her, passengers opened laptops, asked for refills, and checked landing schedules. Ellis opened her phone, not to read messages, but to start recording. On recent flights, she'd started saving the moments she experienced, not for lawsuits, but as a habit, a form of self-preservation. Not to accuse, but to document the unfiltered reality of an America where skin color still operates as the first filter, before any skill or accomplishment is measured. Minutes later, the man in the seat ahead turned to her. "First time flying business?" he asked, half joking, half probing. Ellis gave a soft smile, nodded. She owed no one an explanation for where she sat, especially when she'd earned every inch of it. And then, like a quiet omen, she noticed Roxy standing near the starboard aisle, looking in her direction with a subtle discomfort. A white passenger had just come forward from the back cabin. They spoke briefly. Then Roxy nodded, turned, and began walking toward Ellis. It was time for the next chapter to begin. And Ellie, with the red envelope still resting in her bag, was ready to record everything. Because sometimes, you're not just buying a seat, you're buying the right to watch the system, exactly at the point where it thinks no one's watching. The lighting in the first-class cabin had been set to a warm tone, giving the space the tranquil, refined feel of a five-star hotel lounge. But the moment Ellis Morgan took her seat at 2A, the air around her cracked just slightly. Not a stare, not a single word spoken directly, yet every sideways glance left behind a trail of chill. The man who had just spoken to flight attendant Roxy, Daniels, was also the one assigned to seat 2B beside her. He entered not long after she did, wearing a crisply pressed white shirt that puffed slightly at the shoulders, deep navy slacks, and a gray tie. He had the air of someone far too accustomed to first class and convinced he was entitled to expect perfection in even the smallest details. When he saw Ellis already seated beside him, he paused. His hand didn't rest on the armrest right away, it stayed on the handle of his briefcase, while his gaze lingered on her for longer than politeness allowed. Ellis didn't look over. She knew that gaze too well. The look that suggested she was occupying someone else's space, despite holding a legitimate ticket, despite having every right to be there. After a few seconds of standing still, Daniels walked slowly toward Roxy, who was rechecking the rows up front. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, intentionally so, as if meant for nearby ears. "Is there any chance we can rearrange the seating? I believe there's been a misunderstanding here." Roxy turned, glanced at him, then at Ellis. She stepped forward and leaned slightly in, her smile a flawless template. "Is something wrong?" "Mr. Daniels? My seat is 2B, he said, eyes never leaving Ellis, "but I'm not comfortable with the current setup." He didn't need to be more specific, everyone could fill in the blank. Ellis remained upright, hands resting on her lap, eyes fixed ahead. She didn't move, but a faint vein had risen at her temple, a kind of silence that carried weight. Roxy turned back to Ellis, voice still soft as silk. "Ms. Morgan, I'm afraid there's been a small mix-up in seating. Would you mind if we offered you a seat in the main cabin instead? We'd be happy to offer compensation and—" "No," Ellis cut in, her voice low but sharp. Roxy flinched slightly but kept smiling. "We just want to ensure every passenger has the most pleasant experience possible. If you wouldn't mind, I have a first-class ticket," Ellis said, now meeting Roxy's eyes directly. "Seat 2A." Her tone wasn't raised, wasn't angry, but it shifted the room a beat. Daniels exhaled in disbelief, then stepped back and looked at the attendant. "She just turned down a polite offer from the airline." Ellis turned toward him, her voice even, deliberate. "You have the right to feel uncomfortable, but I am not obligated to give up my seat just because you're unsettled by my presence." Roxy now looked visibly conflicted. She glanced around, then leaned in further, lowering her voice. "Ms. Morgan, if you could just cooperate, we could move you to a quieter section in economy, more space, fewer passengers. It's just to reduce tension." Ellis kept her eyes on the light reflecting from the window. Every word she spoke sounded carved from experience. "You mean this cabin wasn't meant for someone like me, and the tension isn't coming from the stairs cutting into my skin, but from me simply existing here?" Roxy opened her mouth to respond, but Daniels interjected. "Look, I don't have an issue with her, just think the airline should maintain standards. We all know how these community program perks have been going around lately." His words made a few passengers nearby shift their heads, glance sideways, but no one spoke up. Some eyes dodged the moment, others flickered with quiet judgment. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Ellis turned her head, looking at Daniels for the first time. Not angry, not disdainful, just the expression of someone who had heard enough to recognize the root beneath every word. "You're free to believe whatever you want," she said, "but don't hide your discomfort with sitting beside a black woman in first class behind the word standards." Roxy looked around, her eyes unsettled. She spoke quietly. "Miss Morgan, I need you to stay calm." "Calm," Ellis repeated, then let out a soft, dry laugh. Not loud, but laced with something cold. Sitting in my assigned seat. I haven't raised my voice. The person who feels threatened is he, not me. And you're asking me to move so he can feel safe." Her words didn't carry fury, but they were sharp enough to cut through the stillness of the cabin. Roxy straightened up and said nothing more. Daniels clenched his briefcase strap, his face flushed, then turned abruptly and dropped into seat 2B with a heavy sigh. Ellis didn't turn toward him again. She leaned back in her seat, eyes forward, her hands resting lightly on the envelope in the canvas bag at her feet. Inside it, the power remained, and outside, the truth continued to surface, layer by layer, as if the flight itself was peeling back its skin to reveal what it was made of. Above her, the gentle lighting of first class hadn't dimmed, but what now quietly burned wasn't the bulbs. It was the awareness rising in those who had just witnessed a collision between privilege and an unwelcome presence. Under the soft lighting of the first-class cabin, no one said another word after Daniels reluctantly took his seat beside Ellis. The air grew still, but not peaceful. It held a silence particular to spaces where power isn't equally distributed, where every nod of acceptance is laced with resistance, and every averted gaze carries a sliver of complicity. Ellis sat upright, her hands resting lightly on the canvas bag beneath her seat, where the red envelope lay like an invisible weight. The lead cabin manager entered. He was a tall man, his uniform pressed to near perfection, a black scarf tied neatly at the collar, clipboard in hand. On his chest, the name tag read, Grant T. Holloway, lead cabin manager. There was no smile on his face. He didn't need to smile. His authority allowed him to act without pretending to make people comfortable. Grant stopped at the row where Ellis and Daniels were seated. He didn't look at Daniels. His eyes locked onto only one person. "Excuse me, Ms. Morgan," he said in the steady cadence of someone who had recited this phrase 100 times before. "We've just received a notice from ground operations indicating a data discrepancy in the synchronization of the priority boarding list. For accuracy, I'll need to recheck your boarding pass." Ellis didn't respond immediately. She looked at him for a moment, not long, but long enough to pose the unspoken question, "Why only me?" Her hand moved slowly as she reached into her pocket, unlocked her phone with a fingerprint, and presented the digital boarding pass. The QR code still glowed clearly, her name visible. Ellis Morgan, Seat 2A, First Class. No glitch, no issue. Grant took it without a word of thanks or permission. He stared down at the screen, examining it as if hoping to find some overlooked flaw that might justify relocating her. The feeling wasn't new. Ellis had been through dozens of these so-called cross-checks, administrative procedures that appeared neutral but operated through the gears of bias. "Thank you," Grant said after a long pause, returning the phone. "We'll verify this with the central system." Just one sentence, but Ellis knew exactly what it meant. 10 minutes later, Roxy returned, leaning in to whisper something into Grant's ear. They exchanged a few brief words, low enough not to be overheard. Then Grant came back. This time, without asking for anything, simply nodded and turned away. Ellis reopened her phone and checked the internal tracking app installed by Genesis's covert monitoring division. Next to her name on the passenger status feed, a red tag had just appeared, flagged, non-compliant. System verification required. She stayed still, didn't flinch. But something shifted inside her, not out of surprise, but out of confirmation. She had predicted the system would respond this way, yet the moment that label appeared, it etched itself across her dignity like a silent verdict. From that moment on, she was no longer a first-class passenger. Not officially demoted, not fined, not informed. A single identity check and a buried note in the system had reclassified her as a special case. From here forward, every service would come with a shadow of scrutiny. Every look would carry oversight. Any action, no matter how small, could now be logged as a potential behavioral concern. Grant returned minutes later, his demeanor slightly altered. His voice softened a touch, though not with warmth. "We've updated your file. It appears an outdated priority code was attached to your ticket, possibly due to a name overlap in the system. This may have caused a discrepancy in the expected service level for first class, so we'll need to monitor things going forward. Ellis didn't blink. Her eyes didn't leave his. So, my ticket isn't valid? No, it's fully valid, Grant answered quickly. Just a bit of internal classification adjustment. You may continue your flight as usual. A neutral response, designed to pacify, but embedded within it was a systematized form of exclusion. From now on, she had been moved to a category of passengers not fully trusted, even though she had done nothing wrong. Ellis nodded, soft as wind brushing a mirror. No resistance, no follow-up, but in her mind every moment was being recorded, not just in memory, but with tools. She opened her phone again, entered a second-layer authentication code, and activated the cabin activity surveillance mode logging service, behavior, flight attendant movement cycles, and silent audio capture from the space surrounding her seat. No words were necessary. They had flagged her, and from this point forward, every move they made would be flagged too. The hum of the airplane's engines vibrated faintly through the plush carpet of the first-class cabin, brushing against the base of Ellis Morgan's seat like a quiet reminder of the journey ahead, a journey whose ending she already knew, but chose to take anyway, not for the destination, but for everything that would be revealed along the way. She sat still in seat 2A, eyes fixed forward, but her ears stayed alert to every movement around her. Roxy passed by twice, handing out warm towels to seats 1A, 1B, then 3A, 3B. She skipped Ellis both times. Another crew member rolled a basket of bottled water through the aisle. Each row was offered a choice except hers. No one mentioned drinks. Every action was precise enough to feel intentional, as if Ellis had been erased from the service map of the flight. She unlocked her phone and activated the silent logging mode. Each moment of service, or lack of it, was being time-stamped, labeled by location and crew member. The internal monitoring system from Genesis was quietly running, but what she was capturing went beyond data. It held the temperature of emotion, memory, and truths that never made it into reports. When Roxy passed a third time, Ellis shifted slightly, just enough for the overhead light to catch her face. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" Roxy asked, the first words she had spoken to her in over 30 minutes. But her eyes didn't meet Ellis's. They stared past her, into the space beyond, as if addressing a misplaced object. "Just water," Ellis replied. Roxy nodded mechanically, but 10 minutes passed and no water arrived. Ellis turned to the window, watching the runway slide away beneath them. In her gaze, the airport lights blurred into another memory, older, heavier, not so easily wiped away like condensation on glass. She was 14 the first time she flew. It had been a cold morning. A social worker had brought her to the airport so she could attend the funeral of her foster mother in another state. That woman, the one who taught her to write letters by hand and read newspapers instead of watching TV, had died after being pulled over by a white police officer on her way home. They called it a random stop, but Ellis knew nothing is random when black people are 5 times more likely to be told to exit their vehicles. Her foster mother hadn't resisted. She had simply asked, "What did I do wrong?" The answer was a yanked arm from the steering wheel, a shove against the hood, and a sneer. "We're checking your attitude." 3 days later, she died from a brain injury. The report was closed under the phrase, "self-inflicted trauma during restraint." Ellis flew that day in shoes far too large. They belonged to her. She was placed in the back row next to the restroom, even though her ticket was standard economy. A flight attendant had looked past her and said, "You can sit here. It'll be less of a disruption for others." She stayed quiet the entire flight. Didn't cry, didn't speak. But even then, Ellis had learned one thing. Silence doesn't protect anyone. It only lets others feel comfortable while they're doing wrong. Now, on this flight, that memory didn't return in full-frame slow motion. It seeped in like blood from a wound you thought had scabbed. Every time Roxy passed by, every sideways glance from the rows behind her, every tray skipped without mention. They weren't identical to that day, but they were its echoes. After a while, the cabin gave a gentle shudder, a signal that the main meal service was beginning. Ellis lifted her head and caught Roxy in motion, carrying a tray of menus. She stopped at 2B, leaned in close to Daniels, the same man who had earlier complained about her presence. They exchanged a few quiet words, shared a light chuckle, and Roxy jotted down his order in her pad. Then she moved forward and bypassed Ellis entirely, as though seat 2A were empty. Ellis waited a beat before speaking. Not loudly, not harshly, but enough to be heard. "Is there a menu for me?" Roxy turned back, brows slightly raised, her lips holding the same diplomatic smile people wear when they're trying to avoid a confrontation. "I'm not sure if you're eligible for meal service at the moment. Your file was just updated. I'll check with the cabin manager." Ellis nodded. Slowly. Just enough. No further words. Her hand reached down to touch the red envelope in her bag, a reminder that the performance was still following its script. What she was experiencing wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. Outside the window, the sky had turned bluer, but inside the first-class cabin, the lighting remained golden, the voices hushed, and discrimination operated under the guise of politeness. She was being starved without anyone uttering the word hungry. She was being excluded without a single finger being pointed. And in that silence, Ellis began typing a note into Genesis' internal draft system. Exclusion protocol through service structure initiated at 8:16. Actions include omission, denial of beverage, menu delay, absence of eye contact. All actions performed under polite designations, but functionally identical to formal behavioral profiling seen in public service systems. She saved the note and locked it behind a fingerprint. But when the system synced after this flight, each data point would align with cabin cameras, crew service logs, movement tracking, and every unanswered question would become part of the record. Ellis leaned back in her seat. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, because in this society, people like her don't get the luxury of fatigue, even when they've paid for a seat meant to let them rest. Ellis Morgan remained in seat 2A, her posture nearly unchanged since the plane left the ground. But the space around her had shifted, not because of cabin pressure, but because the air was thinning in terms of basic dignity. Every action, every glance from the crew and passengers, each passing minute came like a layer of frost. Not sharp enough to break skin, but cold enough to make old wounds in her memory quietly start to bleed again with every quick stare, every muffled laugh behind her back. The wheels of the service cart rolled softly down the aisle and stopped just behind her row. A white man in a pale blue shirt, hair slicked back with careful gel, stepped forward from row 4 and leaned toward Roxy, gesturing directly at Ellis as if pointing out a defective item on display. "She's in first?" he asked, his eyes squinting with a mix of disbelief and mockery. Roxy didn't pause for a second. She smiled, lips pressed into the kind of polite grin seasoned attendants wear to stay lawsuit-proof, while still signaling condescension. "Probably redeem some miles or something," she said, voice low but loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. Soft laughter rippled from a few rows behind, pulling with it a string of knowing glances. No one had to say anything more. Ellis could feel those laughs echoing in her bones, because they weren't jokes. They were a form of drowning. Roxy didn't approach her. She walked past, a subtle whiff of perfume trailing behind like a calculated fog, then disappeared into the galley at the front of the cabin. In Roxy's mind, Ellis wasn't a problem. She was a floater, someone who had lucked into a first-class seat through a promo, an error, or some diversity incentive. Roxy had seen people like her before. Black, neatly dressed but not refined, eyes sharp but evasive. They usually stayed quiet, tried to blend in, and left without complaint when they were quietly reassigned. She believed she knew every version of Ellis that had ever passed through this cabin, and because of that, Roxy no longer felt the need to extend courtesy. People who don't meet the standard don't deserve the protection of its rules. That single sentence, probably redeemed some miles or something, wasn't just a line, it was a label. It turned Ellis's presence into an anomaly to be ridiculed, not a client to be served. Ellis didn't react immediately, but her grip tightened slightly around the red envelope, not out of defense, but to remind herself everything happening here, every insult wrapped in civility, every contemptuous glance, every laugh disguised as lightness, was not harmless. It was a form of violence. It didn't need shouting or slurs. It only needed a system full of people willing to nod at injustice as long as it happened to someone else. A whisper floated from 3A. An older white woman, deep red lipstick and bleach blonde hair, leaned toward her husband and muttered while glancing at Ellis, "Must be one of those customer diversity programs." The man nodded without looking, offered a forced smile. Ellis heard every word. Each one slid over her skin like a thin blade. Not deep, but cumulative. She didn't rise, she didn't correct, because she knew the real battle wasn't happening here, not in this cabin, not in this moment. It would unfold later, on the ground, where Genesis Holdings' oversight team was reviewing every logged interaction, preparing to decide whether a $4,100,000,000 zero-cents merger should move forward. And she, sitting alone in a space where no one wanted her to exist, was the one holding the final signature. For a brief moment, Ellis thought of her foster mother, of the calloused hand that used to rest on her neck every time she didn't want to go to school after being called a loud-mouthed black girl. Her mother never offered soft words. She only asked, "Do you know where you're sitting?" Back then, Ellis didn't, but now she did. "You're sitting exactly where they don't want you to be, and that's why you stay." Roxy returned after a few minutes, carrying a tray of drinks. She moved methodically through rows 1, 2, and 3, never once stopping at 2A. Ellis watched her, not with coldness, but with the empty stare of someone who no longer expects fairness from the system. Another attendant, Jayla, came to relieve Roxy, briefly holding the tray. She paused when she saw Ellis watching her. For a second, she hesitated, then turned away. One system note. Non-compliant passenger had been enough to instruct staff to quietly reduce service. One offhand comment, probably redeemed some miles, was enough to mark Ellis as someone lucky to be here, rather than someone who had earned her place. And one moment of visible contempt from Roxy had flipped the cabin's attitude, giving silent permission to disregard Ellis altogether. Still, Ellis said nothing, because she knew every move today, from the silence, the jokes, to the distorted flow of service, was being logged. The moment the wheels of the plane touched the runway, the metal grind echoed beneath the cabin with a soft jolt that rippled through the seats. Passengers shifted, some fastening their belts again, others already reaching for their overhead bags. In first class, the atmosphere stirred with new energy, but Ellis Morgan stayed perfectly still, hands resting lightly on her lap, eyes fixed ahead as if another leg of the journey had yet to begin, and it had. The final stretch, and the most important one, wasn't in the air. It was waiting for her on the ground. When the seatbelt light turned off, Ellis remained seated. She waited until the rows ahead of her had gathered their things and rushed out with the usual urgency. Roxy walked past her one last time, offering no smile, no nod, no words, just a glance, the kind that carried the cold satisfaction of someone who believed they had just taught someone else a lesson about knowing their place. Ellis stood, stepping out of her row without haste, her head neither lifted high nor lowered in defeat. She moved as if she were part of the air itself, something no one wanted to notice but couldn't push aside. As she turned into the exit path, a man in an airport security uniform was already waiting. He didn't look hostile, nor did he seem eager. He simply stepped forward, lifted his badge, and said in a flat, practiced tone, "Ms. Ellis Morgan?" She stopped. A nod. "We'd like to escort you to the internal passenger screening area. Just a routine check, nothing serious. Please follow me." Ellis had expected it, from the way Grant had looked at her during descent, from Roxy's sudden shift in tone when handing out the final round of towels. It had all been a signal. A quiet message sent down to the ground, like a cold draft slipping through the cracks of an old system. The room she was taken to was a plain cube. White walls, wooden table, 2 plastic chairs, and a camera tucked in the ceiling corner. It It didn't look like detention, but nothing about it guaranteed she'd be leaving any time soon either. A middle-aged woman in a pale gray blazer was already waiting. Short-cropped hair, thin glasses, a face without warmth. She was Margaret Hensley, head of the airport's internal passenger compliance division. "Ellis Morgan?" Margaret repeated, as if checking a box. "Yes," Ellis replied, sitting in the designated chair, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her back straight, the fatigue visible, but her head held firm. "We've received a report from the flight crew," Margaret continued, sliding a paper across the table. "According to it, you refused to comply with a seat reassignment requested for safety reasons. There are also notations regarding tense behavior with staff, failure to support ticket verification, and inappropriate conduct during the flight." Ellis looked down. The paper was a pre-filled incident form, the title bold and impersonal, "Confirmation of Non-Compliant Behavior." Below it were lines of carefully bureaucratic language, not accusatory enough to trigger a legal defense, but sharp enough to make any passenger sign and walk away, afraid of being flagged as a security concern. "You just need to sign here," Margaret said, "and we'll allow you to exit the airport immediately. If not, we'll have to begin extended procedures. This includes holding your baggage for additional screening and filing a report with the Department of Homeland Security." Ellis didn't respond right away. She placed her hand on the edge of the table, eyes unmoving from the paper. The words swam before her, not because they were unfamiliar, but because they were. Familiar in a way that made her skin crawl. Each line was another invitation to admit fault so that the system never had to explain its own. "I was asked to move because a white passenger said he was uncomfortable sitting next to me," Ellis said, her voice even, each word like a needle threading through cotton. "I didn't cause a scene. I didn't raise my voice. I just refused to give up the seat I'd bought, legally, under my real name, with my own money. Refusing to sign isn't in your best interest, Ms. Morgan. We're trying to avoid escalating this further," Margaret added. Ellis raised an eyebrow. "You say that like I'm the one making this difficult." The woman remained silent, but her expression faltered, just for a moment. That subtle unease was familiar to those tasked with just following protocol when the person across from them refuses to play along. "How many people have sat in rooms like this?" Ellis asked, her tone lower, slower. "Signing papers like this because they made someone uncomfortable? And how many of them looked like me?" Margaret pressed her lips together. Ellis didn't wait. She pushed the paper gently back across the table, never touching the pen. "I'm not signing." The words weren't loud or angry, but they were clear. Clear like a final refusal from someone who had been labeled too many times to believe that a signature was ever just a signature. It was the last piece of evidence, not of misconduct, but of institutional endurance. Margaret paused, then slowly tucked the form back into her folder. "Then we'll need to escalate this to the interagency department." Ellis gave a slight nod. "You do your job. I've already started doing mine. Back on that flight, minute by minute." The woman paused again. When Ellis Morgan refused to sign, keeping herself at a distance from the report as if it carried poison, the entire room seemed to freeze for a beat. Margaret hesitated. She was used to compliance, especially from the black passengers brought into this room, but Ellis wasn't like them, and Margaret knew this woman wasn't just refusing to sign, she was refusing to yield. Margaret took a deep breath, deliberating, then closed the folder. But instead of putting it away, she pressed the internal call button beneath the desk. No sound, just a quiet light flashing in the airport security system. A familiar move, but still effective. When warnings fail, summon something with handcuffs. Within minutes, the doors swung open again. Officer Cole Dermott entered. The cold LED lighting caught the folds of his dark gray uniform like it was pressed by authority itself. His face was square, features set in harsh lines that bordered on menacing, and his steel blue eyes carried zero hesitation. He didn't rush, but every step reminded you he wasn't here to talk. He was here to end things. Margaret stood, nodded slightly. "Officer Dermott," she said softly, "non-compliance, unusual behavior. refusal to cooperate with security screening. May require temporary transfer. No more explanation needed. Cole glanced at Ellis, his stare openly appraising. A flicker of contempt touched his lips as he stepped forward, one hand resting on the cuffs at his belt. Ellis didn't rise. She looked straight at him, meeting his gaze without flinching. Her eyes weren't angry, but sharp enough to cut through the room. "Ms. Morgan," Cole began, voice slow, almost ceremonial, like he was reading a charge sheet. "I've received a report that you've refused to sign a behavior notice, demonstrated confrontational behavior with airport staff, and failed to cooperate with post-flight screening. As per my authority, I'll need to—" "What are you going to do?" Ellis interrupted. Her voice wasn't raised, but it was so clear that not a syllable could be ignored. Cole paused, then smirked. Not friendly, just the practiced smirk of someone used to control, mistaking composure for submission. "I'll be escorting you to the passenger holding area for full documentation. You'll be treated properly if you comply. If not—" He unlatched the handcuff holster. Margaret gave a slight nod, as if confirming the moment had met protocol. Ellis stood. She didn't retreat, didn't falter. "You going to cuff me for refusing to sign a false report?" Cole raised an eyebrow. "You're being combative." "Combative is what you call a black woman who doesn't bow her head when threatened," Ellis replied, her tone sharp for the first time. Cole stepped forward, eyes narrowing. Ellis stepped too, half a pace, and stopped. Only inches now separated them. No one in the room moved. "You know something, Officer Dermott," she said, her voice calm but honed like a blade. "I've reviewed this airport's personnel records. Your name isn't new to complaints from black passengers. Most were marked insufficient evidence, weren't they?" A security staffer in the corner shifted slightly. Margaret glanced toward Cole. He smirked. "Think you're going to scare me with some clever words?" "Not words," Ellis answered, lowering her hand to the canvas bag at her side. "Facts." She pulled out a document, this time not the red envelope. A printout from Genesis' internal surveillance system. "Cole Dermott, Complaint Index 5, Formal Investigation 0, Status Active, Exception, Cleared via internal liaison." She held it up to Margaret. "You know, there's a kind of privilege that doesn't need proof, just silence. And you've been very good at knowing when to be silent." Margaret's mouth parted slightly, but Ellis had already turned back to Cole. "And you, man, once accused of physically handling a black traveler for using the wrong lane, were sent to escort me because I wouldn't sign a lie." Cole clenched his jaw. He hadn't lowered his hand from the cuffs, but now every movement of his body seemed heavier, slower, because what Ellis had brought wasn't emotion, it was evidence. "You can cuff me," she said, eyes unwavering, "but you'll need to document your reason. And when that reason reaches Genesis Holdings Investment Oversight Team, the same team currently monitoring security and personnel compliance at this airport, you'll have to prove that your actions weren't racist, weren't an abuse of power, and had nothing to do with the organization quietly pushing me to sign." Cole said nothing. The silence around him was no longer steady. A sheen of sweat crept along his forehead, something not often seen on a man used to restraining people on the street. Margaret turned away and tapped quickly on her phone. No one in the room spoke. Ellis lowered her hand. Her eyes didn't. They held their edge, cold and deliberate. "The flight is over," she said, "but your problem is just beginning. I've been quiet long enough, I've watched long enough, and today I've documented everything. Every word, every glance, every deviation in service. From the moment your flight attendant looked at me like I'd wandered into the wrong world." A sharp ping broke the silence coming from Margaret's phone. She looked down at the screen, her face drained of color. No need for explanation. Ellis knew what had just happened. A message had been delivered, straight from the shareholder governance office, and likely her name now sat at the top of that screen. Ellis Morgan, Sr., authorized oversight agent for Genesis in the financial distribution network linked to Havenport Air. They all remained standing in that small, cold room when Ellis Morgan, without raising her voice or asserting any posture of command, reached into her canvas bag and placed 2 red envelopes on the table. No announcement, no excess movement. Every gesture light as air, but the weight of it hit like stone. The first envelope was thick, sealed in red wax embossed with the Genesis Financial Holdings emblem, a name that needed no introduction in aviation, finance, or infrastructure. Inside it, the full valuation dossier for the year's largest merger, a deal that would dictate ownership networks, operational control, and a restructuring investment exceeding $4 billion. The second envelope, thinner, smaller, but far more precise, contained direct authorization, stamped and verified by Genesis, granting its holder final signing authority and the power to withdraw approval at any moment, should violations of fairness or transparency be uncovered within the service chain. Margaret Hensley, the same woman who moments earlier had tried to push Ellis into signing a misconduct report, was no longer sitting upright. Her eyes were locked on the wax seal, and in that moment, a career spent navigating paperwork told her exactly what she was seeing. This wasn't a bluff. This was jurisdictional power. She swallowed, just once, but the sound echoed like a gunshot in the still room. Her gaze darted to Cole Dermott, who had instinctively taken half a step back, as if something in his body understood what his mind hadn't fully caught up to. The woman he had just considered cuffing had the authority to dismantle the very system he was meant to uphold. Ellis didn't look at either of them. She simply opened the thinner envelope and removed a single, smooth, heavy sheet with silver edging. On it, the authorization code, investor registration ID, date of approval, and a name printed in bold capital letters: Elis Morgan, fiduciary agent, primary strategic voting holder, Genesis Financial Holdings. She said nothing. The silence in the room no longer belonged to routine. It belonged to revelation, the kind of silence that settles in when people realize that the black woman they ignored, ridiculed, denied food and service, and nearly cuffed in front of a badge, was the one person with the power to bring down the structure they were paid to protect. Margaret gripped the edge of the table, feeling her pulse throb at her temples. She knew the name, had read it recently in a finance bulletin, listed among the next generation of transformative leaders in global capital management. But no one said she'd be on this flight. No one said the woman in a simple hoodie, canvas shoes, a clean bun, and a calm stare would be the one with the authority to shutter entire portfolios with a single personal decision. Cole was different. He didn't understand markets or mergers, but he understood power, and he understood it was now recoiling. The force he had tried to impose was turning on him, a boomerang that had just exposed a system of racialized abuse that he represented all too well. "You," he began, but the words stopped halfway. For the first time, language felt more dangerous than a weapon. Ellis slid the document back into the envelope, slowly and precisely, like closing a door, not out of fear, but so they'd see. Every move she made was deliberate. Every silence was a warning. "You think power is something you can see in a badge or a name tag?" she said, her voice low and unwavering. "But real power lives in who gets excluded and who gets to rewrite the rules. And today, you excluded the wrong person." Less than 15 minutes after Ellis Morgan stepped out of the screening room, the artificial calm of the airport security coordination hub began to crack. On the main monitor in surveillance control room 3B, a line of code flashed. No alarm, no siren, just a small blue icon blinking in the lower corner. A technician noticed it, frowning. He'd never seen this access ID before. Hovering over the text triggered a quiet, chilling phrase to appear: "Audit override, Genesis flag." Before anyone could react, the system began pulling every recording, every audio file, and every service log from the recent flight, from gate C9 to seat 2A, from the lead cabin manager to the crew assigned to first class. The system wasn't fast, but it was surgical. Cabin cameras, internal microphones, service logs. Everything was being extracted and sent to an external server outside the airport's operational chain. Margaret Hensley had just begun to rise, ready to verify Miss Morgan's file, when a coordinator walked in carrying a thick printout, lips dry. "Director," he whispered, "a fiduciary-level audit request from Genesis just hit the system." "An audit of what?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice even. "The entire crew from Flight 82 to Denver," he said. "And the post-landing security handling. There's a fiduciary clearance attached." The room temperature dropped. Everyone there knew. Fiduciary-level access meant strategic authority. It was issued only in high-stakes investment disputes or when internal conduct raised red flags. Whoever held it could trigger a full operational review. And now, that person was Ellis Morgan. Moments later, audio clips began playing over the internal speakers. Roxy's voice came first, crisp and unmistakable, pulled from the cabin mic before boarding. "Thought this was first class, not a welfare program." Another crew member laughed in response. Then came Grant, the cabin lead. "As long as she doesn't make a scene mid-air, just leave her. We're not the ones cleaning up anyway." Another segment followed, this time from a ground-to-air comm feed between Roxy and an agent. "Flag her. Just use a check safety protocol excuse." No one in the room moved. Each clip landed like a blow to the head. What had once been private venting inside a sealed system was now public evidence, slow, precise, and damning. On a side monitor, the first-class manifest loaded in full. Roles, notes, personnel codes. Under Passenger 2A appeared the name with no ambiguity, Morgan Ellis, Genesis Holdings, Strategic Fiduciary Authority, Level 4 clearance. Every line shattered the usual justifications the system had long used to defend its apathy. Ellis hadn't shouted, she hadn't cursed, she had let the evidence speak, and this time it had teeth. At the back of the room, Cole Dermott stood stiff, spine drawn like a bowstring, his eyes fixed on the fourth audio clip, his voice over the internal radio. "I'll deal with her after landing. Might need to soft hold if she pushes. No formal orders, no report of a threat." He'd acted because, like 100 times before, he believed the system would always protect him. But this time, he was wrong. Ellis hadn't yelled at him. She hadn't insulted anyone. She had simply left 2 red envelopes on the table, like summons to a courtroom that needed no judge. All she had to do was not sign. I was not backing down, was to stay silent at the exact right moment and let the system indict itself. Cole said nothing. He turned and walked out of the room like a man who had heard his sentence before it was spoken, stunned that it came so quickly. He now knew no one was going to protect him. He was no longer the enforcer. He was the observer. Margaret sank into her seat, sweat glistening on her temples, while Roxy, having just received a notification from senior HR requesting an urgent disciplinary meeting, frantically tried to delete audio files from her system, unaware that all versions had already been locked with interbank-grade encryption. Not far away, down a quiet corridor, Ellis Morgan walked calmly toward the VIP lounge. Within minutes of the internal recordings being extracted and transmitted across the personnel oversight networks, the fallout had already grown far beyond the walls of the airport. It spread like an emergency signal pulsing through fiber optics, reaching every executive floor inside Havenport Air, where every mouse click now carried consequences. On the 27th floor of Havenport's headquarters, the normally quiet Strategic Operations Suite was flooded with ringing phones, red-flagged emails, and blinking alerts cascading across screens. An emergency audit, launched by Genesis Holdings, had just gone live. No warning, no meeting request, only a subject line: Emergency Compliance Review Stakeholder Incident, Ellis Morgan. The first person to read that name, the head of legal, stood up so fast his chair rolled back, eyes scanning the internal shareholder roster. And there, under Strategic Silent Stakeholder, the name appeared like a verdict in bold, undeniable type. Ellis Morgan, Tier 4 Fiduciary Agent, Genesis Holdings, Asset Protection Lead. Instantly, the system flagged the full personnel file from Flight 882. Every crew member, from the lead flight attendant to the gate agent at C9, notices were dispatched to 3 key individuals: Roxy Gable, lead attendant of the first-class cabin; Grant McAllen, cabin supervisor; and Vince Carter, boarding gate personnel. They were ordered to report immediately to Internal Affairs, without the right to refuse, under the following allegation: racial bias, abuse of service standards, and breach of fiduciary conduct. On the 14th floor, inside HR's private hearing room, where high-level investigations were usually handled quietly, silence was no longer an option. Roxy sat across a long table, her face pale. She'd just come off shift, still in uniform, name badge intact, a thin layer of lipstick remaining. But all the composure was gone. Behind her, a large monitor replayed the same clip for the 3rd time in 30 minutes. Thought this was first class, not a welfare program. No one asked why she said it. The answer lived in the tone that followed. Laughter, not needing approval, because it only worked when someone's dignity was already excluded from the room. Beside her, Grant, the cabin lead, tried to maintain posture, but the confidence in his eyes was gone. When asked to produce any formal instruction justifying his attempt to move Ellis to economy for the comfort of other passengers, he failed. There was no memo, no security directive, just habit, long-standing practiced habit of pushing people who didn't look the part out of premium spaces. Vince, the gate agent, sat with his head down, fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. A clip from the gate camera played next, Vince taking Ellis's boarding pass, glancing for a second, then handing it back without scanning. A moment later, on his radio, "I think she's at the wrong gate. Looks more like a support class than a first." No one in the room said sorry, not because they didn't know they were wrong, but because they no longer knew where to begin. The system they believed was untouchable, the one that had shielded their glances, upheld their instincts, and disguised their biases as procedure, was now turning on them. An internal auditor from Genesis, flown in from the Regional Compliance Division, stood with a thick file in hand. Her voice was clinical. "Are you aware," she began, "that under the merger terms between Genesis and Havenport, any discriminatory act, service denial, or breach of process involving a Tier 4 strategic stakeholder automatically triggers a suspension of disbursement?" Roxy and Grant didn't lift their heads. Vince swallowed hard. "And now," the auditor continued, "we're not just suspending. We are formally reviewing the reallocation of investment priority to a competing carrier with verified inclusive practices and non-discriminatory policy enforcement. Your behavior isn't personal misconduct. It's a liability that endangers a $4,100,000,000 zero-cents system-wide restructure. From executive offices above, an internal memo was sent to all departments. The entire Flight 82 crew was under investigation for racial bias and suspended from active duty pending final review from Genesis Holdings. Internal chat channels erupted. Some expressed shock. Others whispered, "I saw it coming," but no one publicly defended Roxy, Grant, or Vince, because everyone understood this was no longer about staff and passengers. This was about a system confronting someone it couldn't control, and for the first time in years, that someone was a black woman. Ellis didn't return to the airline to confront them. She didn't appear at any hearing. She let the truth speak for itself. Through documentation, through protocol, through the systems they had once used to keep her out. And now, the system that tried to contain her was closing in on the very people who had weaponized it. The sky above the city was pale blue as usual the next morning, but inside Havenport Air's HR system, an undercurrent had begun to rise. Just one quiet line appeared in the internal system: Flight Roster Update. Level 3 reallocation initiated. The first to notice something was off was a flight scheduler checking the day's rotation. Under the New York-Paris international route, normally handled by the veteran crew led by Cabin Chief Grant McAllen, His name had suddenly disappeared from the active list. Roxy Gable, the senior first-class flight attendant once seen as the go-to for flagship routes, was also removed from 2 luxury long hauls that month. Both were replaced by unfamiliar names, pulled from the domestic service pools, crew members who'd never been considered for priority assignments before. Grant only learned he'd been pulled when a 3-line email landed in his inbox. Your assignment for the 15th has been transferred. You are temporarily reassigned to domestic operations. Details will be provided by your direct manager. No explanation, no reply, just a relocation. And for people like Grant and Roxy, being removed from first class might as well have been a public demotion. Inside a small meeting room at Terminal F, Roxy sat silently, still holding her name badge with its fading International Senior Lead emblem. Sunlight filtered through the narrow window and cast her shadow on the floor, not as a symbol of pride, but as a spotlight on the truth. That title now belonged to the past. She'd read the internal reports, heard the extracted recordings, seen her name in the email from Strategic Compliance, with the subject line, Temporary Reassignment, Pending Cultural Training Review. No one needed to say the word demotion. The system did that on its own. The same system that once protected her, once erased critical comments from her performance reviews, once buffered her from accountability, was now the one writing her sentence. Quietly, precisely. Grant reacted differently. He had long been the poster figure for first-class professionalism. His calm voice, measured pace, and polished image regularly featured in the airline's luxury service campaign. But this morning he sat at his desk, staring at his new rotation. Denver to Phoenix, Chicago to Cleveland, then Minneapolis to Des Moines. These were flights with no French wine, no warmed towels, no passengers addressed by academic title, just people crammed, shoulder to shoulder, shoving carry-ons into low ceilings and yawning through red-eye fatigue. This must be a misunderstanding, he muttered to HR, but the manager only looked back in silence. This is a consequence, they replied. No hearing required. The system was reallocated per Genesis Holdings' recommendation. Meanwhile, Margaret Hensley received a call at 7:12 a.m., just as she was about to enter the main building. It wasn't a summons, nor an official inquiry, just a brief notice from internal compliance. You are placed on unpaid leave during the investigation of procedural misconduct in handling protected stakeholder classification. The final sentence slid through her like a blade across pride. If you require legal counsel, contact the HR representative office. She hung up the phone and didn't walk inside. No one escorted her out. Her reflection in the glass doors receded, no longer a gatekeeper of passenger verification, but a removed cog from a system she once believed untouchable. And Vince Carter, the boarding agent at Gate C9 who had once dismissed Ellis's ticket and muttered, "She didn't look first class" to a colleague, was called into the office at 9:00 a.m. In his hand was a sheet, not a warning, but a notice of unpaid administrative leave. Below the bolded header, pending outcome of racial profiling investigation. As he stepped out, he caught the eye of a young black colleague, an agent who worked the same terminal. She didn't speak, just looked at him, an expression neither angry nor triumphant, but one that carried a quiet warning. And in that moment, Vince felt the weight of the word bias with a clarity he'd never known. None of them were fired. No headlines were published. No disciplinary markers appeared on their badges, but the quiet shuffling of assignments was the sharpest punishment of all, because it made no noise. It was slow, but absolute. And for those who once believed they had the power to decide who belonged in which seat, who deserved a warm drink or a silk towel, being shifted out of first class was a verdict that needed no court. That afternoon, sunlight streamed through the large windows of the VIP lounge at Havenport Airport, casting soft light across the marble table where Ellis Morgan sat alone. There were no clicking heels across the wood floors, no scripted concierge voices. No one asked if she needed anything, and strangely, she didn't. On the table, next to a cup of tea long gone cold, was a slim brown envelope. unnoticed under the edge of a guest chair. When she reached down to pick it up, she saw only 2 words on the front, written in blue ink, slanted and slightly shaky: Ellis Morgan. She opened it, pulling out a folded sheet of letter paper. Light blue lines, slightly yellowed at the edges. The handwriting was careful, the ink still faintly fresh, with a soft trace of perfume. The only thing in this entire journey that wasn't digital. Miss Morgan, I don't know what to call you. Shareholder, supervisor, or witness. So I'm calling you the only way that makes me feel safe. Sister, it began. My name is Jayla. I was a flight attendant on that flight. I stood just 3 rows away. I heard Roxy's joke. I saw the way Grant looked at you when you didn't stand up. I witnessed the moment everyone skipped your meal service. And I stayed silent. The whole flight, I wondered, should I lean down and ask if you wanted water? Should I circle back when I see the cabin tablet flag your name? But I didn't. I was afraid. Afraid of losing my job. Afraid of being labeled disloyal. Afraid I didn't have enough rank to change anything. But when you walked off that plane, upright, unbowed, I realized something. It's me who's been helping this system survive, with my silence. Today you stood up, and because of that, tomorrow I might live a little more honestly. As soon as the plane landed, I filed a full report with internal oversight. I listed every name, every joke, every order, every silent assist. I also requested to be moved to the Passenger Assistance Division, somewhere less dangerous, somewhere with less bowing. Thank you for not yelling. Thank you for staying silent at the right moment. I know you don't need praise, but I needed you to know. You saved a piece of my spirit I thought I'd lost. Signed, Jayla. As Ellis finished reading, her heart felt wrapped, tight, not with pain, but recognition. Jayla, the young woman with warm brown skin and darting eyes, had been invisible on that flight, and now she was the quiet witness who saw, who felt, and who chose to act. Ellis understood, more than anyone, how revolutionary it was for a junior black staff member to submit a formal report with the full names of violators. It wasn't just a letter. It was an uprising made of honesty. On the table, Ellis's phone vibrated gently. It was an email confirmation from Genesis's internal compliance team. Jayla's report had been received and flagged for priority review. She would be invited to join the Working Group for Cultural Policy Reform. But Ellis didn't open the message. She set her phone down and lightly ran her fingers over the letter again, as if reading it through touch, through a connection no electronic file could replicate. The system hadn't changed yet, but someone inside it had. And sometimes one person is enough to begin the domino fall of awakening. A lounge staff member passed by and briefly looked at Ellis. He nodded. This time his eyes didn't avoid hers. They didn't linger with curiosity either. They simply acknowledged her, as if to say, "We know who you are, and thank you for not staying silent." Ellis stood. She folded the letter and slipped it into a side pocket of her bag, between thick folders of financial documentation. It held no legal weight, but to her it was the most powerful proof that a black woman not only belonged, but could shift the ground beneath her feet. As she stepped out of the lounge, the sky was still blue, but something had changed. Not the weather, but the air itself. The air of a system that once suffocated people like her now is beginning to breathe again. Not in the voice of authority, but in the quiet bravery of people like Jayla. And that's something no disciplinary action can command, no boardroom can orchestrate. That is a shift, silent, but irreversible. 3 days after the incident at Havenport, the airline's public relations office sent a special message to Ellis Morgan's personal address, an official apology from the CEO. Attached was a draft press release, pre-written, polished, filled with the usual phrases like regrettable, misunderstanding, commitment to improvement, and, of course, the familiar closing line. "We apologize if your experience made you feel disrespected." Ellis read the draft in under 5 minutes. Then she set it down without a word. There was no anger on her face, no sarcasm, only a cold neutrality, like someone staring at a mask that no longer hid anything behind it. Because she understood that the apology wasn't meant for her, It was meant for shareholders, for the media, for boardrooms afraid of disruption. It was a linguistic shield, crafted so the system could keep running without ever confronting its fracture. Instead of replying, Ellis opened her laptop. She typed slowly, deliberately, without posturing, without victimhood. She wasn't writing to vent, she was writing to name something that had long lived in the silence between meaningless apologies. 2 days later, her piece appeared on the front page of Aviation Journal, a respected publication followed by airline executives, service leaders, and luxury market investors. The title was simple, just one sentence. I don't need your apology. I need a system that makes apologies unnecessary. In the article, Ellis never named the airline. She called out to no one directly, but each paragraph slid like a blade beneath the polished layers of industry protocol. No one yelled at me during that flight. No one used slurs. No one said I didn't belong. But every skipped glance, every ignored meal, every recheck of a ticket already scanned was the system's way of saying, you are not meant to be here. And I don't need anyone to stand in front of a camera and say sorry, because the failure isn't a person. It's the repetition of silence. It's a process that makes black passengers prove their legitimacy 3 times over, just to sit in peace like anyone else. An apology is a blanket over the wound, hiding the fact that the wound was designed by the protocol itself. And if today you apologize to me, but tomorrow still train your staff to rate passengers by their service potential, your apology is worthless. The piece was short, just over 1,200 words, but within 48 hours it had been shared across nearly every aviation industry group on LinkedIn. 3 major airlines' heads of customer experience left comments. A senior director at a global service standards body reposted it with the caption, "This is not an opinion piece, this is a mirror." Some disagreed. Some quietly deleted their reposts once they saw Ellis listed as a strategic stakeholder at Genesis, but no one disputed the truth in her words. Because the article didn't demand confessions, it demanded that people confront the machinery. At Havenport Air's headquarters, the article was printed and placed on every department head's desk. One regional director read the last paragraph, closed the paper, sat in silence for 2 full minutes, then turned to his assistant and asked, "Have we ever trained crew on managing implicit bias?" The assistant shook her head. "Do we have any material requiring staff to intervene if a colleague shows discriminatory behavior?" Another shake of the head. Then, "We're doing it wrong, legally," he concluded flatly. At the airport, Jayla, the black flight attendant who had written Ellis the handwritten note, read the piece while sitting in the break room of her new department. She didn't share it. She didn't comment. She just folded the article, placed it in her notebook, and stepped out into the corridor, her stride lighter than it had been in days. As for Ellis, when asked by an independent journalist whether she would accept an apology if the airline held a formal press event, invited her to speak, and stood her before the media, she simply smiled faintly. Apologies might matter to the people who gave the offense, but I'm not someone waiting for it to move forward. Then she reached into her bag and placed Jayla's letter on the table. The part I kept. For Ellis Morgan, that article wasn't about justice for one person. It was about jolting an entire industry, one that had printed words like kindness on napkins and welcome cards, but forgotten how to live by them in the first-class cabin. And perhaps the saddest truth her article revealed was this. If she hadn't been holding 41% of the strategic stake, everything would have ended at the first bag check. At the annual aviation conference, where dark suits strolled beside elegant evening gowns and crystal chandeliers spilled light across the gleaming marble floor, Ellis Morgan entered like a current moving against the tide. She wore no name tag. She didn't need recognition. Her presence alone was the message. She was no longer a passenger. She sat on the high-authority fiduciary register, the kind of list where a single nod could shift numbers larger than the entire media budgets of most major airlines. Her calm silence, the steady focus in her eyes, the way she walked slowly past model aircraft displays and polished service showcases, All of it made those who once didn't know her name now either avoid her gaze or step forward, hand outstretched. And then, at a display booth on the mezzanine floor, where Havenport Air's exhibit stood, there was Roxy Gable. She wore the standard uniform for cabin representatives at the event, but the usual nameplate reading Lead Attendant, First Class Experience, had been replaced with something more modest, Guest Relations, Domestic Division. She was arranging a stack of brochures when she caught sight of a figure approaching. Her hand faltered at the edge of the display. When she looked up, her eyes met Ellis, the woman she once tried to remove from first class, the one she had judged as not fitting the image. Ellis didn't stop. She simply slowed. Her expression wasn't cold, nor was it mocking. It was steady. So steady that Roxy suddenly felt her high heels lose some of their grip, and then, as Ellis passed close enough for her voice to remain low but unmistakable, she said with calm, merciless clarity, "You once said I didn't belong in first class. You were right. I don't belong. I came to buy it." Roxy froze. Her lips didn't move. A chill slid down her spine, as if those words weren't just a statement but a verdict. In her mind, Flight 882 flickered like a screen with no off switch. She saw Ellis again, seated silently, unresisting. Only, for every misstep of the crew to later be revealed, every name called out in a full system audit. But what shook her most wasn't that Ellis had the power to remove her privileges. It was the fact that Roxy had never imagined someone like Ellis could even possess such authority. Her regret wasn't pure. It was tangled in shame, in the sting of demotion, in a simmering resentment. Part of her wanted to believe she was just a product of a system, that she'd done what countless others had done in the industry, assess passengers based on image, demeanor, and sometimes skin color. But the truth was, she had chosen to make that cruel joke. She had chosen to laugh with Grant. She had chosen silence, when her silence gave power to exclusion. Now, watching Ellis pass like a living embodiment of a power she'd never even fathomed, Roxy felt something nameless. It wasn't fear. It wasn't just shame. It was the feeling of being made small, not by accusation, but by the realization that everything she once took pride in, international flight hours, insider connections, managerial praise, meant nothing against a woman she once labeled as out of place. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to redeem herself. But as Ellis melted back into the flow of the conference crowd, Roxy stood still. Not a word came. No language could unmake the choices she had repeated for years, cloaked in the habits of professionalism. For the first time, she understood the weight of silent power, not the kind that shouts or slams a desk, but the kind that doesn't need to speak to make a system look at itself, the kind that doesn't ask to prove worth, because the system itself has just proven how desperately it once tried to deny that worth. The conference carried on as if nothing had happened. Banners advertising elite service fluttered gently. Sample meals were passed around with charming pitches, but in one corner of that mezzanine floor, a former face of premium experience stood motionless, her mind echoing one line, "I don't belong. I came to buy it." And for the first time, Roxy Gable understood that first class was never just a seat. It was a symbol, a mechanism, a belief that only certain people were meant to pass through. But Ellis Morgan hadn't asked to enter. She hadn't waited for permission. She didn't need anyone to open the door. She came carrying the keys to redesign the door entirely. Just days after the conference, when the name Ellis Morgan was no longer a quiet footnote in stakeholder reports but the focal point of an entire industry, the board of directors at Havenport Air convened an emergency meeting on Monday morning. Present in the glass-walled room were senior legal advisors and a representative from Genesis Holdings. The LED display on the wall glowed with a simple title, Post-Incident Strategic Direction Proposal from Stakeholder E. Morgan. No one in the room knew what Ellis would propose. Some privately expected terminations. Others anticipated demands for compensation or an expensive PR campaign to restore the brand's image. But no one predicted what she offered, because it wasn't punishment, it was a new framework. Her proposal was just 13 pages long, divided into 3 clear sections: internal systems assessment, independent oversight, and a retraining mechanism. But the point that made the room collectively hold its breath was the introduction of the Flight Equity Protocol, a comprehensive re-education initiative for all frontline personnel, from check-in staff and flight attendants to security officers. It wouldn't be conducted in-house. It would be designed and executed by 3 independent nonprofits. One of them, Altimeter Watch, stood out. The name sparked a quiet shift in the room. It was a racial bias watchdog group in the service industry, founded by Ellis Morgan 3 years ago. Ellis asked for no compensation. She didn't call for disciplinary action or legal retaliation. Her writing was composed and incisive. Change doesn't begin by removing people. It begins by rebuilding the structure that convinced them they were acting correctly. When asked why she chose reform over retribution, she answered plainly, "I don't need to see them gone. I need to see them changed." The proposal went to the Internal Ethics Council, and for the first time in the airline's history, not a single vote opposed it. No one had grounds to say no to a woman who had, through silence, shaken an entire system, and through a single essay, forced an industry to confront itself. Everyone knew that resisting this now would ensure the story outgrew a single airline or incident. It would become a cautionary tale in every upcoming human rights symposium. 2 weeks later, the official announcement was made. Havenport Air had entered a formal partnership with 3 independent oversight groups and would begin implementing the Flight Equity Protocol, a 6-month mandatory retraining program for all customer-facing staff. The internal email didn't mention punishment or emergency corrective action. Instead, it was called the Initiative, a comprehensive restructuring of the customer experience standard toward service equity. But anyone in the industry understood what that meant. This was Ellis Morgan's footprint. Jayla, the flight attendant who once wrote Ellis a handwritten letter, was invited to join the training content team. Alongside her were other employees who had volunteered to share their experiences of being overlooked, doubted, or diminished because of their skin color or hairstyle. The retraining sessions weren't corporate diversity seminars with bullet points and platitudes. They were led by people who understood exclusion not from policy manuals, but from eye contact, from misspelled names, from having to justify their presence twice as often as anyone else. Ellis didn't attend in person. She watched from afar, but during each progress briefing, her face would quietly appear on screen. She never dominated the meetings. Sometimes she simply nodded or asked one question, sharp enough to make the whole room pause. That was enough. It told everyone she wasn't here to clean up a mess. She was here to rewrite the rules. No one had been forgiven. They'd been given a second chance, and no one dared waste it. Elsewhere in the airport, as flight boards flickered with departures, Grant read the internal memo outlining the new training schedule. Roxy, once the face of first-class experience, sat nearby jotting down notes from the behavioral re-evaluation module. On her table there was no longer a handcrafted espresso from the premium staff lounge, just a lukewarm drip coffee from the vending machine near the baggage counter. The privileges that once let them walk tall were now only memories. But Ellis had never sought to erase those memories. She simply demanded that the system look at them clearly and ask, what were those memories built upon? And what allowed someone like her, a woman once flagged as not fitting for first class, to become the very person rewriting the protocols that governed it? Outside the boardroom, the morning hadn't fully arrived, but within the industry something had already begun to shift. Not loudly, not theatrically, just in subtle signs. Flight schedules being sent out an hour earlier than usual, greetings to new employees sounding less performative, boarding passes being scanned with steady eyes, not judgmental ones, and all of it traced back to one woman who never needed to fight for a seat, because she understood she wasn't there to claim a spot. She was there to redraw the seating map so no one after her would have to bow their head and ask, "Am I allowed to sit here?" In the quiet afternoons, when the work had retreated behind closed doors and the high-level meetings ended without resistance, Ellis often sat alone by the floor-to-ceiling window of her office. Beyond the glass stretched a skyline thick with towers, broadcast masts, and American flags fluttering in the wind. The scene always stirred something complicated in her, part pride, part unrest. She wondered, among all the principles America has ever claimed, freedom, democracy, equal opportunity, what made it so that a segment of its people had to walk slower, just because of the color of their skin? Why, as fellow citizens, were some still asked an extra question at check-in, given an extra glance at dinner, required an extra round of justification just to access the same service they paid for like anyone else? Ellis didn't want to believe America was a lie. She believed in it. She believed in the ideals it professed. But she also knew those ideals would never steer themselves unless someone was willing to grip the wheel and redirect it. She didn't seek collapse. She didn't crave revenge. The days of carrying rage had passed for her, long ago when she stood beside the plain wooden coffin of her foster mother, a black woman who died after a routine traffic stop with no evidence, no compensation, and not a single official explanation. That day, Ellis learned there are deaths no one calls unjust, simply because the person who died had the wrong skin color in the eyes of the system. But now, she didn't want anyone else to pay for that. Not another staffer, not another passenger, not another child growing up afraid that the world would see them as a threat before knowing their name. She didn't want a society where only financially powerful Black Americans were treated with respect. She wanted a society where no one needed to prove they were harmless to be allowed through a first-class door. That's why, in her final reform proposal to the Interagency Service Council, a federal advisory group on citizen service standards, Ellis didn't use terms like minority rights. She wrote simply, "We don't need more seats on the current power map. We need a new map, one where everyone begins at the same point, not because someone won privilege, but because no one is docked value at the starting line." She believed America could be that place. But to become it, America had to stop viewing equity as one group's victory over another and start treating it as a matter of urgency. Because every day without change was one more opportunity stolen from those who should have been walking without fear. Ellis understood this wouldn't happen overnight. But she didn't need it to come quickly. She needed it to come true, to arrive through awareness, through transparent systems, through new generations of staff, trained from the beginning not to replicate the invisible dismissals that had pushed so many people like her out of first class in their own lives. Looking back, Ellis didn't see herself as a hero. She was simply someone who had been silent too long, who had bowed her head too many times, and who finally stood, not to claim a higher seat, but to create level ground where no one would be pushed lower simply for being born with a color they didn't choose. Outside, sunlight streamed across the street below. Cars passed like lines of time still in motion. Ellis brushed her hand gently along the rim of her cooled coffee cup, eyes distant but not dim. The America she believed in, it was still there. Not in its promises, but in the quiet acts now rising from deep within the very system that once denied her. And if someone were to ask her, "Do you think justice will ever truly exist?" she would simply smile, without the need to say yes or no. The next day, Havenport Airport moved to its usual rhythm, passengers pulling suitcases through security checkpoints, flight announcements echoing at regular intervals, quiet lines forming before check-in counters. But amidst the familiar, something new had appeared. A large poster, displayed prominently at the center of the departures floor. Against a clean white background was a half-length portrait of Ellis Morgan, her gaze direct, her expression neither inviting nor distant. Beneath it, a single line, simple and without fanfare. "A journey doesn't begin with a boarding pass, It begins with the right to board as a human being. The image wasn't part of an ad campaign. It was quietly installed at the request of Genesis Holdings, as part of Havenport Air's commitment to transparency and cultural reform. And it didn't take long for it to become a stopping point for countless eyes, some curious, some contemplative, some hesitant, and some quietly nodding in recognition. Among those passing by was a boy, around 7 years old, gripping his mother's hand. They had just returned from Texas after visiting his grandmother in the hospital. His red sneakers bounced alongside his mother's linen dress, his steps energetic, until he came to a sudden stop in front of the poster. "Who's that, Mom?" he asked, his voice soft, eyes still fixed on the photo. His mother paused. Her eyes followed her son's gaze. Then she gently lowered herself, placing a hand on his shoulder as if to pass on something deeper than words. "She's the reason you can sit wherever you want, son." The boy blinked. The answer came with no long explanation. Yet somehow he understood that the woman in the photo wasn't a celebrity. She didn't smile. She didn't extend a welcoming hand. But something in her eyes made him feel safe and proud, even if he didn't fully grasp why. His mother said nothing more. But, in her heart, the memories of being overstepped by airport staff, of being held back for carrying too many skincare items, of the scrutinizing glances when she booked business class to take her mother for treatment, those memories began to fade, little by little, as if someone were rewriting them in a gentler shade. She knew clearly. Ellis Morgan hadn't done this for recognition, not for praise, but for children like her son, so that one day, when they grow up, they wouldn't have to ask, "Mom, am I allowed to sit there?" Because they would understand from the start, every seat on that plane, every right to be served, every respectful glance, they could carry with them without needing to convince anyone they belonged. And today's quiet words would become tomorrow's enduring stories. Ellis's story continued to spread, not through loud debates or trending hashtags, but through a silence that felt like a quiet promise. New flight attendants hired by Havenport now read about Flight 882 as part of orientation, not as an accident, but as a turning point. Training sessions no longer began with how to please customers, but with how to see the human being in each passenger. In a northern state, a group of black law students started a research project on civil rights in commercial service spaces, naming it Seat 2A, simply because that was the seat Ellis once occupied, a place that had become a symbol of what was once denied and what was ultimately reclaimed. At the offices of Genesis Holdings, internal memos on investment and corporate governance were updated with a new clause, the Stakeholder Equality Clause, mandating that any funded company must implement independent auditing mechanisms for service-based discrimination. That clause was encoded as EM41, a designation that anyone in the industry would recognize as referring to Ellis Morgan and the 41% equity she represented, but even more so to what she had done with the remaining percent of the system, the part that isn't written on paper, but lives in how people treat each other. That night, in a quiet corner of her office, Ellis read a printed email from the airport coordination team. It was a report of positive passenger feedback from the pilot training program, including one anonymous comment from a mother. "For the first time, I didn't have to explain to my son why we were screened twice while others weren't." Ellis folded the paper, placed it on her desk, and closed her eyes. She knew every change would meet with skepticism. Some would call it politics, others commerce. But what mattered most to her was that one child had passed by a photograph and, for the first time in his life, seen someone who looked like him standing tall in history. Not because someone allowed it, but because she had stepped forward and never looked back. And that child's gaze, that seemingly innocent question, became the most powerful proof that what Ellis had done was right. Because if one child could look at that photo and see the future, then it was no longer a personal victory. It was a generational step forward. The story of Ellis Morgan didn't begin with confrontation. It began with a silence repeated so many times it eventually became a voice. She didn't need to shout to demand justice. She just stood firm, listened, remembered, and rewrote what had once been hidden. From a passenger questioned and sidelined, Ellis became the one redefining standards for an entire industry, not through rage, but through responsibility, not through revenge, but through reconstruction. And in the end, she left behind more than a legacy. She left behind the belief that justice can move forward through quiet conviction, without needing to beg for recognition. If it were you, would you choose silence? Or rewrite the system like Ellis did? If this story made you think, like, share, and subscribe to help spread more journeys that dare to change the system itself.